The money they created out of thin air to inject into the economy, that same money just goes away. Just as magically as it appeared out of thin air, it goes away out of thin air. This is the game. This is what happens with the Federal Reserve. So the Fed is saying no. At the same time, Trump is saying you gotta do it. You gotta do it. Act now. This is why you've heard talk of President Trump saying, hey, maybe I can just get rid of Jerome Powell and put a new Fed chair in there that's gonna roll with the way I want him to roll. Again, there's a trickle-down effect on all of us, consumers, businesses, investors, employees, all of us are affected in various ways. So this video is not to alarm you or to scare you. It's just to say, hey, we need to be aware. Because if we're fitting in this society, this economic society here in America, we need to be aware of what's going on. Guys, most people have no idea what's about to happen. There is some heat brewing between the Federal Reserve and the President Donald Trump. And on this quick video, I want to explain to you exactly what that rift is all about. What's the issue? First, let me start off by explaining what took place last week, just 3 or 4 days ago. The Federal Open Market Committee. It's the committee of the Federal Reserve that actually decides whether or not they're going to lower the Fed funds rate or they're going to increase it or keep it the same. They met last week and they came to a conclusion that they're going to leave the Fed funds rate exactly where it's at. And that means they're going to leave the Fed funds rate at between 4.25% and 4.5%. Now, that's the third straight meeting they've had in a row where they haven't touched the Fed funds rate. Now, why is that significant? It's significant because of the potential impact of these tariffs that President Trump has sort of instituted and the impact of all of that on inflation and the economic growth here in America. So let me explain it like this. And this is why it's really critical for us as Americans to understand this thing as consumers and understand this thing as business owners and understand this whole thing as investors. Trump wants the Fed to lower the Fed funds rate. Why? Because when the Fed lowers the Fed funds rate, it incentivizes or encourages people to get out and spend money, right? It makes the cost of borrowing money cheaper, which makes people go and borrow money, right? It encourages people like you and me to go out and get that personal loan, that car loan, use our credit cards, whatever it could be, right? It gives us the motivation to go out and say, hey, money is cheap now. Let's go borrow some money or let's go spend more money. And it also makes Trump look good from a political standpoint, right? If he can sort of see the rates coming down and people out spending money during his time in the presidency, it's a feather in his cap, right? Let's just be real about it. Now, whether you like Trump or you don't like Trump doesn't really matter to me, right? I'm just giving you the facts of what's actually happening right now. So Trump says, we need you, Federal Reserve, to lower the Fed funds rate, right? To get everybody out spending. But at the same time, the Fed says, hold up. The Fed Chair, Jerome Powell, and the Federal Open Market Committee, they said, no, hold up. We ain't touching the Fed funds rate at this point. In fact, they had a unanimous vote where everybody on the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, they all said, no, we're not going to lower the Fed funds rate. Why? Because inflation, this is their report, they said inflation is still stubborn. And if the Fed lowers the Fed funds rate, that's really an inflationary type of act because you're getting everybody out there to spend money, right? Because again, when money is cheap to borrow and the Fed funds rate goes down, it incentivizes people to go spend more money. And guess what happens when everybody spends more money? Prices go up, right? I mean, just think about it. If you're a business and let's say you sell cell phones, if you sell cell phones as a business and everybody has money to go out and buy your cell phones that you sell, then guess what? Are you going to lower the price of your cell phone? Everybody has money. Everybody's incentivized to go borrow money to buy your cell phones that you sell. So you're not going to ever lower your cell phone price at that point. You're going to, in fact, probably increase the price of your cell phones. So that's why when you give everybody money and you incentivize them to go out and spend and borrow cheaper money, it makes prices go up. So again, Fed lowers the rates, demand for items go up, demand goes up, prices go up. Well, we know that inflation has already stagnated around 2.8, 2.9% for the PCE inflation rate, which the Fed wants to get down to 2%. They've been talking about it and harping about it in every press conference for the last 3 or 4 years. We need inflation down to 2%. It still ain't got down to 2%. So the Fed is saying if we lower the Fed funds rate and get everybody out there spending, guess what? inflation will probably go the opposite direction from where we want it to go, down to 2%. It's probably going to go up to 2.9, 3%, 3.5%. It's going to go higher. Now, the Fed also in their meetings, they acknowledge the fact that perhaps rising risk of unemployment to increase because of the economic climate, because of the possible impact of tariffs and all that. And they acknowledge the fact that inflation has been sort of stagnated at around 2.8, 2.9%, and it hasn't gone lower like they want. So the Fed said, no, we're not going to touch rates. We're going to be more at a wait and see to see how these tariffs impact the rest of the economy before we make another move, right? So the Fed pointed specifically to this uncertainty of tariffs in their decision and in their press release that they put out for everybody to read as the main reason for them holding steady on the Fed funds rate. Now, that puts them at direct odds with President Trump. Now, here's the other thing that I thought was really interesting that the Fed said in their press release, and I'll have to pull it up so I can read it, all right? So the Fed said in their press release that we will continue reducing our holdings of Treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. That's all they said about this. But this is key, and I'm going to tell you why it's key, right? Because when you first read the statement, it sounds very innocent, right? We're going to continue to reduce our holdings of mortgage-backed securities and treasuries. No big deal. But you got to probe into that just a little bit. I want to explain to you. I'm going to take 2 or 3 minutes out to explain this to you really fast. See, at the start of the pandemic back in 2020, the Federal Reserve went out and purchased a whole bunch of bonds. Now, the Fed has a balance sheet. That means the Fed has assets they own and they have liabilities they owe. So on the Fed's asset side of their balance sheet are bonds that they purchased during the pandemic. Now, them purchasing these bonds is the policy that's called quantitative easing, QE. You might have heard about it. So in February of 2020, before the pandemic, the Fed's assets on their balance sheet were about $4.2 trillion. Before the pandemic, February of 2020, $4.2 trillion worth of assets. By the time we got to April of 2022, a little over 2 years later, the Fed's balance sheet, their assets on their balance sheet, had gone from 4.2 trillion to 9 trillion. Wow. The Fed more than doubled their assets on their balance sheet in just over 2 years. Wow. Where did all these extra assets come from? Because the Fed purchased bonds from financial institutions and banks. How? Well, here's what happened. The Fed and the U.S. Treasury literally, guys, printed out of thin air almost $5 trillion worth of money. They just printed nearly $5 trillion worth of money. The Fed took that money that was printed out of thin air and they went and bought bonds from banks and financial institutions, right? And this is money that's printed out of thin air. So you wonder why the dollar has lost its value so rapidly in the last few years. It's because they're printing money out of thin air. Out of nowhere, just printing it. Here's how it works. The Fed prints $5 trillion worth of money. The Fed takes these trillions of dollars and they buy bonds from banks and financial institutions. So the Fed gets back bonds and the banks and financial institutions get back money, cash. Not literally cash, but credits, but we'll call them cash to make this example simple. They get back cash. What can they do with that cash at banks and financial institutions? They can loan it to people like me and you and businesses. So now the banks have a whole bunch of cash to loan and the Fed has bonds on its balance sheet. Well, why does these banks want to have all this money to loan? Because remember, at the beginning of the pandemic, everything was shut down. So if everything is shut down and nobody is spending money, the Fed said we need to inject a bunch of money into the system. We're going to buy a bunch of these mortgage-backed securities. We're going to buy a bunch of these bonds and we're going to inject money into the banks. So the banks now have more money to loan you, me and you. And at the same time, the Fed said, not only are we going to inject all this money into banks by buying bonds from them, but we're also going to go ahead and lower the interest rates. And so remember, around 2020, 2021, interest rates was really, really low. So money was cheap to borrow and the banks had a whole bunch of money that you could borrow from them. And not to mention, the federal government at the same time in 2020 and 2021, the federal government was handing me and you stimulus checks in the total amounts of nearly $800 billion. And they were also providing PPP loans to businesses in the amounts of almost $800 billion as well. So businesses had $800 billion. Consumers in the economy had $800 billion worth of stimulus checks. Banks now had trillions of dollars they could loan to you, and the rates were low. I mean, think about it, guys. At this point, that explains exactly why by the time we got to 2023, we had the largest inflation rate in 40 years. Inflation was crazy in 2023. It went crazy because of all of this liquidity that the Fed pumped into the market. Liquidity is a fancy word for money. Cash, right? They pumped a bunch of cash into the economy to make everybody spend. And all that spending did what? It raised inflation to record levels, right? And that's why we got this inflation that we got in 2023. And then immediately, once inflation got way up, what did the Fed do? They totally reversed that policy of quantitative easing, and they started doing quantitative tightening, QT. And what quantitative tightening is, it means, you know what, we put all that money out there, now we want to pull it all back, right? So guess what we're going to do? The Fed said we're going to raise interest rates. And so in the summer of 2023, they started raising the interest rates. Why? To cool off that period of incredible spending from during the pandemic. So they said, now we're going to tighten things up. And guess what happened to those bonds that the Fed purchased and put cash into the banks and got back bonds? Now the Fed says we're going to continue reducing our holdings and mortgage-backed securities. In other words, the money they created out of thin air, right, to inject into the economy, that same money just goes away out of thin air. They just let all that stuff roll off of their asset side of their balance sheet, and it goes away just as magically as it appeared out of thin air. It goes away out of thin air. This is the game, right? This is what happens with the Federal Reserve. And a lot of people really don't understand it. But this is what happens. They create money out of thin air, inject it into the economy. That's called quantitative easing. When they want to pull that back because of all that spending has an effect on the inflation rate, they quantitative tightening. They pull it back. They let the bonds roll off their balance sheet. So when the Fed says we're going to reduce our holdings, that's all they're talking about, is letting bonds roll off the asset side of their balance sheet, right? Typically, when a bond becomes due, the person that you bought the bond from has to pay you. But those banks don't have to pay the Fed. Those banks just issued bonds, got a bunch of money from the Fed, and now they never have to pay the Fed because a bond is just a loan. Whenever you hear the word bond, think of loan. It's a loan from the person who bought the bond, and the issuer of the bond has to pay back the person that bought the bond. That don't happen with the Fed. We're talking about the Fed. We're talking about federal government agencies. We're talking about U.S. Treasury. We're talking about banks. All these things are working together to keep this machine running. So the rules that we think of in terms of how things work, they go out the window, right? Now, the Fed said, hey, we did all that. We printed all that money back then because we needed to stabilize the economy because of all the panic that was setting in from businesses who couldn't sell their wares and their goods because nobody was buying anything in 2020, right? So the Fed said we had to lower interest rates. We had to give out all this PPP loan money and all this stimulus money, and we had to inject a bunch of liquidity, cash money into the economy. This is what the Fed is saying, why they did it. Right? To stimulate demand for stuff so people would buy and we could keep this machine running. Now, the example I gave you was really, really simplified, but I wanted to simplify it just to get the point across and you get the big picture of how this thing works and why the Fed is now saying we can't keep lowering rates because if we lower rates too fast, too soon, it's going to cause everybody to start spending money, and that's going to add to the inflation that's already there, not to mention the tariffs and threats of tariffs is going to add to inflation as well. So the Fed is saying no. At the same time, Trump is saying you got to do it. You got to do it. Act now. Bring the Fed funds rate down. And this is where the clash happens between the Fed Chair Jerome Powell and the FOMC committee who decides and President Trump. And this is why you've heard talk of President Trump saying, hey, maybe I can just get rid of Jerome Powell and put a new Fed chair in there that's going to roll with the way I want him to roll. And you maybe heard Fed chair say, no, I'm not stepping down. I'm not going to. That was kind of in the news the last week or so as well. So what's about to happen? What's about to happen is higher interest rates for longer and perhaps more inflation. depending on what happens with these tariffs. Now, how does that impact me and you as consumers, small business owners, as investors, small investors? Well, higher interest rates means a slower economy, right? It means less economic activity when people have to pay more to borrow money. It means businesses maybe can't get that extra equipment they need to expand their business. It means maybe we don't go out and get that loan that we were going to get, that personal loan. Maybe we don't get that car loan and purchase cars, right? All these things are affected because of a higher interest rate. It means reduced spending on the part of consumers and businesses. It means reduced investing. And all of that hinders job growth, because when businesses and consumers ain't spending so much, guess what happens to employment? Employment can suffer because now businesses have to lay off people, or businesses have to pay wages that don't increase at the same rate that inflation is increasing. So there's a lot of trickle-down effects of having higher interest rates. It also trickles down to higher rates for mortgages. I mean, think about it like this. We know the Fed funds rate does not directly impact mortgage rates. Mortgage rates are typically tied to the 10-year Treasury, right? However, there's sort of a positive correlation between the two. So when the Fed funds rate goes down, typically and usually mortgage rates go down, right? What it costs to take out a mortgage and pay a mortgage goes down. When Fed funds rate goes up, mortgage rates typically go up, right? Sort of a positive correlation between the two. So the Fed fund directly impacts short-term loans, right? The credit cards, the car notes, and the personal loans that banks give out. But look, when rates are high, and people have to pay more for their mortgages or to borrow money, it means that people have less disposable income to use. For example, guys, think about it. If your mortgage rate is 7% and then your mortgage rate drops to 4%, the difference between a 7% mortgage and a 4% mortgage could be $1,000. That's $1,000 less dollars that a family has to spend on other stuff when the mortgage rate is 7%, right? So when rates are high, it trickles down and it has an effect on all of us as consumers, right? Not just the price of eggs or the price of milk or the price of gas, but the price to have a mortgage, because businesses and consumers, they all struggle when interest rates are higher. And if interest rates are higher for too long, guess what happens in terms of the stock market, right? The stock market is not booming like it would be booming when rates are high as well, because the stock market is just a collection of businesses. And if businesses can't borrow money cheaper, businesses are going to suffer, right? And so if businesses suffer, it means the stock market is going to be suffering as well. So it also affects us as investors who want to see our money grow. And if the stock market is down, it means instead of my S&P 500 VOO or my S&P 500 other ETF or index fund, instead of having a 10% return for the year, it may have a negative 10% for the year. So we lose money on the investment side too. Again, there's a trickle-down effect on all of us, consumers, businesses, investors, employees. All of us are affected in various ways when the rates remain too high for too long. So in my opinion, guys, this clash between the Fed funds rate, or the Federal Reserve, and Jerome Powell refusing to lower the rate, and Donald Trump, who says we need you to lower the rate as soon as possible, act now, that's important. I don't think most people really understand what's about to happen or what may happen as a result of that clash. So this video is not to alarm you or to scare you. It's just to say, hey, we need to be aware. Because if we're fitting in this society, this economic society here in America, as consumers, as small business owners, as investors, as people who are employed in jobs, we need to be aware of what's going on. We need to have an idea of how this whole thing is fitting together and what's going on with this conflict between the Federal Reserve and the president wanting them to lower those rates. Guys, I hope this video was helpful and it at least explained a few things to you in some regular, everyday, normal, easy to understand language that gives you an insight to sort of how this whole thing is working. Guys, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you want an update like this, just a real quick summary, breaking this thing down into regular, easy to understand language on this tariff situation that's happening. As I make this video right now, America is over in Switzerland having talks with China as they kind of start the talk that will hopefully break up this tariff conflict or war that appears to be about to really take place. So if you want an update like this on that in a day or two, let me know that in the comments section as well. Guys, share this video, smash that like button, And don't forget to drop that comment. Hey, the best person who's going to take care of the old you is the young you. Guys, take good care of yourself and take care of other people. Until the next video, peace.